Good afternoon, everyone. My name is DM Rawlings. I am the 10-Minute DM. I am an experienced Forge in the Dark GM, and I want to offer some advice here, 10 minutes at a time. So today I wanted to talk about making good, impactful consequences for your Forge in the Dark game. We're going to start off here with my first point. Consequence needs to be consequential. Right? That seems pretty obvious, but you'd be surprised at how many times I see consequences float by that are really easy to get around and don't really impact the game in any meaningful way. So when you're creating your complications, make sure that it is going to have an immediate impact, making the situation more complicated, or it's going to increase the risk of complicating something later, like getting a harm. One is not a big deal, but later on it really adds up and it could cause a big problem. If you've got consequences that are too easy to avoid, stop, maybe think a little more, and choose one that's going to be more impactful. And if you are struggling to find consequences that make sense for the role, then maybe that role wasn't needed. My advice is the moment that the player starts to think about a role is the time when you should start thinking about your consequences so that you've got the most time to come up with something that fits the fiction. Number 2, they progress the story. So good consequences move the story forward, even when the die fails. So what do I mean by that? After a roll, the scene should meaningfully change in some way. You shouldn't be able to immediately make the same roll again, like say you fail a lockpicking check. Well, maybe you hear a guard approaching, or maybe the pick is broken, or maybe the lock proves beyond your capabilities. What you're doing there is you're moving the fiction forward so that you have to take another approach to this. And when you are setting these consequences, you should remember that they set the cadence of your story. Every single setback and obstacle that ramps up the session's tension is going to do so more and more until you're coming in screaming past the finish line at the end of your mission. So kind of think about it like a toboggan going down a hill. Initially, things are pretty slow, you feel like you're in control, nothing bad seems to be happening, then things start to speed up and you start to get nervous, and then as you reach kind of that bottom corner, things are starting to go wild, you're holding on for dear life, and then you roll into the end, everything's worked out, you didn't die, and you probably won. This is where your players are going to have the most fun, and this is what you should be aspiring to do when you're progressing the story with your consequences. Number 3, they follow the fiction. So good consequences feel like a natural progression of the story. What we're doing is we're drawing contextual clues from where the story is right now. And when people are told what the consequences, they always go, yeah, that kind of checks out. That makes sense to me. They're not jarring. They don't feel like they're out of left field. One of the strengths of Forge in the Dark games is that we can tailor these consequences to what's happening in the game at the moment. So it allows for more possible outcomes. It makes the game feel much more personal. We can surprise ourselves at the table, even as a GM. And then we'll get places that we never would have otherwise because we were using the moment that was created by all of the players as well as yourself. So what inspirations can we pull from? Well, obviously, the one that matters the most is what's happening immediately in the scene, but you can always review the assignment and see if there are other things that might be interesting to pull into play. There's the greater world of Candela Obscura itself, and then there's the individual characters' backgrounds and relationships and aspirations and dreams and things like that. All of those become good fodder for complications later down the line. Number 4, they match the stakes. Good consequences reflect the stakes of a role. And I mean, this is just following the rules, right? A high-stakes consequence is going to be worse than a low-stakes one. For instance, maybe someone witnessed something that they shouldn't. If the stakes were low, it's the town drunk, and no one would ever believe them. If it's normal, then maybe it's a maid at a hotel, and maybe she'll tell her friends, and maybe they'll tell their friends, but is it going to get back in some significant way? Probably, but it's not really the worst thing in the world. It's something that you can handle. If the stakes are high, well, unfortunately, you happen to be doing it in front of Newfair's most ambitious reporter, and it's very good chance this is going to be in the paper tomorrow unless you do something about it. So low stakes, normal stakes, high stakes, very important for consideration when you're doing things. And almost every consequence can slide up and down this scale, so whenever you're thinking about what might happen, tune your consequences accordingly. One of the things that I love to do when I'm watching someone run a Forged in the Dark game is as they're assessing consequences, I'll say to myself, okay, well, what was a low stakes situation there? What was a high stakes situation there? And I'll just run that every single time that I'm watching an actual play, and that's how I practice getting my consequences down. Number 5, they respect pacing. So good consequences manage your assignment's pace. The consequences that you choose drastically alter the game. They can increase or decrease the intensity of a moment, and they can make the assignment take longer or shorter, so that you can make sure that if your session is expected to only last a certain amount of time, you're hitting the climax at the right point, and you're not rushing to the end, or you're not getting there sooner than you want. So they can start or end an action sequence, right? If something eldritch starts moving, or maybe there's the sound of chanting in the distance, all of a sudden that's a cue for your adventurers to get up and go and stop investigating whatever the scene is, right? Or you can slow things down. You can say the monster escapes, or the building collapses, evidence is lost, whatever else. But all of a sudden this moment that you had has come to a grinding halt. Alternatively, you could extend or shorten a session, depending on which consequence that you choose. If you want to go longer, you can introduce a new faction, and all of a sudden that turns into a big fiasco, right? Or maybe a collapse or some kind of thing with a door opening reveals that there's actually now a network of tunnels. So now there's a new problem in front of them that they have to deal with. Or if you want to shorten things down, maybe if there was a secondary objective during the mission, that part fails. So they only have to focus on the main thing, and it's closing off doors for them to force them to move towards the primary goal and not get distracted by other things. Or, maybe characters start taking harm because they're on some kind of clock, or you can tell there's some imminent peril in order to get people moving. The more you play, the better a sense you're going to have about how to pace out your sessions. And I know, as I've been learning, and even still to this day, I will kick myself because I create consequences that add to the gameplay when I didn't have the time to see them fulfilled properly. So just watch out for that one. And number 6, they respect expertise. So good consequences portray your investigators as capable professionals. We shouldn't invalidate the skill of our characters due to a failure. So what we try to do instead is we try to make things not their fault. Maybe it's something they didn't know, maybe it's something that they couldn't have expected to overcome, maybe it's some kind of happenstance beyond their control. But if you've got a character and they've got a strike of 2, don't make them fumble and drop their knife when they get a consequence for a roll. Instead, maybe get it lodged in a monster's ribcage, or focus on something else that doesn't diminish their level of skill in all of this. Right? I see GMs fall into this pitfall more often than you'd think, where all of a sudden you've got like Looney Tunes instead of a Forge in the Dark game, and so long as you're respecting the capabilities of your characters and focus on satisfying their fiction, then you should be okay here. And of course, if they had a strike of 0 in that situation, just let loose, have some fun with it. So yeah, in closing, I would very much like to say that there are many, many different ways to approach consequences, and the way that you use those consequences can have a pretty profound impact on how the game ends up turning out. So I hope this helps guide you in some of the choices that you may need to make along the way. I've been DM Rawlings, the 10-Minute DM, and if you do like what you see, please hit that subscribe button. It does mean a lot to me. Have a great day.